Thank you so much. And I just want to say before expectations get too high, I am not nearly as smart as Lake George. So thank you so much, and thank you all for coming out this morning. You know, I grew up in New York my first 17 years on Long Island, and I never got to Lake George until this trip. So I really want to thank the fund for everything they're doing, but also for sort of filling that incredible gap in my water repertoire. So this is amazing. So I wrote Replenish, my book, my last book, from this perspective of what I would call realistic optimism. The idea, as we'll see in a minute, that yes, the water problems out there are really, really big, but with collaboration, innovation, with a commitment to action like we've been hearing this morning, we can fix this. And Lake George is really a great example of that. And we're going to come back to Lake George at the end of my talk, but I want to try to scale us out a little bit this morning and think about the global context and the national context of these challenges, so we can sort of see the larger picture and also, you know, how we fit in. So let's dive in. So back in December, this past December, we celebrated the 50th anniversary of this very iconic photo. Some of you may recall it was taken by the Apollo 8 astronauts in December, actually Christmas Eve of December 1968. And for the very first time, we got this image of planet Earth in its very vulnerable state, right out there alone in space. But it also showed us what an incredible gem of a planet it is, this blue and white orb in this darkness of space that told us just how incredibly fortunate we are to live on this water-wealthy planet. But less than 1% of all that blue is actually fresh water that we can use for drinking, for growing food, for making our clothes and our computers, for swimming and boating and all the things that we need and enjoy. Less than 1% is fresh and accessible. And as we can see in this image, it is finite, right? But as we've seen over the decades, our demands for water, our demands for the use of that water are not finite. And we're going to come back to that. 6 months after this photo was taken by the Apollo 8 astronauts, the Cuyahoga River in Ohio burned for the 13th time. This was in June of 1969. Again, we just celebrated the 50th anniversary of the last time the Cuyahoga River caught fire. And this was an incredible wake-up call. Following on the heels of Rachel Carson's Silent Spring, the Cuyahoga River catching fire kind of woke us up. And thanks to some political leaders in Cleveland at the time who went to Congress and talked about what was happening to their river, which of course was a problem in many rivers. But here a river is catching fire, and we sort of woke up and said, this is not right. This had been going on for decades, but it was not right. The next year was our first Earth Day, 1970. 2 years later, we passed the Clean Water Act, the last major piece of national federal legislation to deal with fresh water at that scale. And so last month, I was on the banks of the Cuyahoga River, which now looks like this. An incredible degree of success in the last 50 years, and something we can be very proud of. But while we've come a long way, we have this whole new sort of class of threats to water around the world that are going to very much affect our water security going forward. And what I think is that we need very much today a kind of, booster rocket moment like we had 50 years ago to deal with these new threats nationally, globally, and locally and regionally, as we've been hearing this morning. So I want to talk a little bit about what those are, and then come into the idea of solutions. I can tell I'm going to need some of this scarce water. Is one of these mine? Yes. Okay. There's something about this issue that always makes me thirsty. Let me just have a quick sip here. It's very dry up here. So let's have a quick look at what these new challenges are. Now I've lost my clicker. Here we go. So first of all, we have this map of global water depletion that's been getting redder and redder and redder in my time working on water. I've been working on water now for 35 years. When I first started, this map would have looked much less red. And if you look at where these red areas are, it's almost all of our major food-producing regions in the world: India, China, Pakistan, of course, the United States. And what's going on in these regions is a number of things. We have groundwater being depleted. As much as 10% of our food supply globally now depends on the unsustainable use of groundwater, right? So that's kind of a bubble in the food economy we're going to have to deal with in some fashion. We have rivers running dry. Here's the Colorado, the lifeline of the American Southwest. This is roughly what the last 90 miles of the Colorado River looks like. This is in Mexico. We think of the Colorado as ending at the border, but actually the last 90 miles are in Mexico. And this is pretty much what that looks like now. It used to be a lush wetland area. But also China's Yellow River, the Nile, the Ganges. You can name a number more major rivers that are no longer reaching the sea, that are drying up for extended periods of time. We have lakes beginning to shrink. How many of you know the Aral Sea story? Let me give you the Reader's Digest version. This lake had a big impact on me when I went to visit it. It used to be the world's 4th largest lake. This photo was the earliest one I could find, the one on the left, and it was taken in 1964 by satellites. This was, of course, during the Cold War years, taken by US satellites, and gave us an image of what the Aral Sea once looked like. Again, the 4th largest lake in the world. And what happened was, as happens with many ecosystems, right, many freshwater bodies, Soviet central planners looked at this lake and the 2 major rivers that were supporting it, that were keeping this lake going, and said that water would be more valuable if we diverted it out and used it to grow cotton in the desert of Central Asia. And so that's what they did. And so of the 2 major rivers flowing in, most of the water was diverted out. A very lucrative cotton production industry was created in the agricultural areas that were created, and the lake began to shrink. And so this was not unplanned, right? This was a planned destruction, if you will, of an ecosystem the size of Ireland. And when I went to the lake in the mid-90s, the World Bank was doing some work, and they'd asked some people to come over. I'd never been there. It was astonishing to me to see sort of what had been the outlines of this lake, now kind of white with salt, rotting ships in the former lake bed. You couldn't see the lake. It was 25 miles away, the actual water. And the towns were like ghost towns. You know, most of the women were anemic, the health of the people had declined, the fishing industry was gone, and the people were in such despair. It was a very challenging moment for us who had been over there as sort of the experts. There was nothing we could really say to fix this problem. And it taught me, and it just stayed with me, just how incredibly linked the health of an ecosystem is to the people and the economy and the community that lives around that lake, that depends on that ecosystem. And that just stayed with me, and it's relevant to every story I've seen since. We've heard a lot of talk this morning about water quality concerns, and in some ways, I think these algal blooms are a bit of the sleeping tiger of our water challenges on the water quality side. I think of groundwater depletion as the sleeping tiger on the water supply side, out of sight, out of mind. I think these rising algal blooms are a bit of a sleeping tiger on the water quality side. We've talked about cleaning up the Cuyahoga River and our rivers, but we have not really figured out and begun to deal with these so-called non-point sources, mostly agricultural land, farms, septic systems, and those areas that are generating lots and lots of nutrients, phosphorus and nitrogen, and bringing them into our lakes and streams and into our coastal zones. Some of you may remember this photo. This is taken from the summer of 2014, when the western end of Lake Erie, which is the shallower, Lake Erie is the smallest of the Great Lakes, and that western end is the shallowest portion of Lake Erie, and so it tends to be less able to dilute all those nutrients coming in. And Toledo, Ohio, had to inform its residents to stop drinking their water coming out of their taps, not to fill their pets' water bowls, because this toxic bloom had basically arisen right over the water intake for the public water supply of Toledo, Ohio. And this toxin, microcystin, is known to have already killed some dogs, to be a risk to human health, and so they basically had to say, don't drink the water. And talk about a wake-up call. This was an incredible concern for not only Toledo, but any public utility that drew its drinking water from sources that could have a similar thing happen, which of course is quite a few. At the same time, not at the same time, 2 years later, the governor of Florida had to basically declare an emergency in coastal Florida because algal blooms had broken out along the coast. This is the St. Lucie estuary. This is one of the areas that was deeply affected at that time. You can see this pea soup green water, and basically, again, state of emergency due to this rise in algal blooms. We're seeing also that this excess nitrogen and phosphorus is creating more and more of what we call dead zones. When this algae decomposes, it consumes oxygen. And so you get less and less oxygen in the water, sometimes as little as none. And so anything living in that water, any fish, any aquatic organisms, are basically highly, highly stressed, if not killed. And so if you're a swimming fish, you can get out of there. If you can't swim, you're going to be vulnerable to death. And so we see now that there's more than 400, some scientists say 500 dead zones worldwide. And this is very much affecting not only property values and tourism in these coastal areas, but the fisheries and the aquatic life that depends on it. We've seen roughly a doubling in the number of these dead zones for the last few decades. They're doubling, the number is doubling about every decade at this point. Again, largely due to this runoff of nutrients into our waters. And the last important global trend I want to mention is what's happening to freshwater life overall. This statistic that just came out last fall kind of blew me away. This is from the World Wildlife Fund's Living Planet Index, and they basically found that the average abundance of freshwater vertebrate populations, so these are freshwater fish, freshwater fish and mussels and amphibians, frogs and so on, that their numbers, this is not species, overall numbers of animals in freshwater environments has declined by 83%. So stated otherwise, if we had 100 fish and frogs 50 years ago, we have 17 of them now. So much less life in our freshwater environments. And this is a real concern. This is the web of life that supports everything that's beginning to dramatically shrink. And of course, along with this, we have a reduction in species. We're sending species to extinction as well. So the combination says to me that our freshwater systems are really, really on the brink in terms of their functionality, right, and their ability to function and deliver the kind of benefits and services that we enjoy, but also to support the rest of life on the planet. This is a wake-up number to keep in mind. Climate change, of course, will worsen all of these trends, and it's kind of hard to wrap our minds around exactly what this will mean. A couple years back, actually a decade ago now, scientists wrote a paper in Science called "Stationarity is Dead." These were 8 very internationally recognized scientists. Stationarity is dead. And what they meant by that is that we can no longer assume that the past is a reliable guide to the future. And I think we can no longer think of the past as a reliable guide even to the here and now. As we heard from Dr. Kelly this morning, it's going to affect how algal blooms materialize in lakes around the world. Water temperature, water quality is going to be changing. We know the kinds of algae we're worried about do better, they grow faster and bigger in warm water. The waters are going to be warming. What's that going to look like? We're going to see more floods and droughts. Part of the reason that NOAA is expecting a very big algal bloom in the western part of Lake Erie again this summer is because of the floods in the Midwest. They're washing all that nitrogen off the farms into the lakes, into the streams and creeks, into the lakes, into Lake Erie. NOAA is also predicting a very large dead zone in the Gulf of Mexico this year. Why? Because all that nitrogen in the Mississippi Basin is funneling down toward Louisiana and into the Gulf. And NOAA says we can expect a dead zone the size of Massachusetts this year, probably the second biggest on record. A major storm could influence that, but on point right now, we're looking for that to happen this summer. So these trends are going to be changing. All these things are challenges anyway, but they're going to get more challenging for us. And so the ability to prepare, to plan, to understand how climate change and global warming is going to affect this is really, really important. It all begins with the fact that a warmer atmosphere can hold more moisture, and that changes the whole physics of how the water cycle works and how it plays out. So this kind of information technology that we're hearing about this morning is just going to be essential to understanding what's coming down the pike. I love this statement by someone who's probably smarter than Lake George. We can't solve problems by using the same kind of thinking we used when we created them. And so when it comes to water, what does this really mean? What was that, or is that, thinking about water that has sort of brought us to this place? And we heard little bits and pieces of this morning, but I think if I were to encapsulate it, it's something like, we've thought of water very much as a resource, right? A resource that's there for us to take, to use, to grow our wealth. And we've done a very good job of that. But we haven't really been thinking about these ecosystems, about nature and natural water systems in terms of the wealth they generate as a living, functioning system. We've been thinking them as resources for the taking, not so much as living systems in and of themselves. Does that make sense? And I think in some ways we've generated an enormous amount of prosperity from that kind of thinking. We've applied this incredible science and engineering. I mean, think about Big Hoover Dam on Lake Mead as sort of the iconic symbol of this kind of thinking, right? It's generated an enormous amount of prosperity, allowed for food production, hydropower generation, water storage at a very, very large scale, moving water around to supply cities in the desert, floods protected by these big levees. I mean, it's really pretty amazing what the engineering of water has done. But if you think about it, that has involved what we might think of as kind of a Faustian bargain, because it's given us this prosperity, and yet it's broken the water cycle, right? The natural way water is stored in nature, the way it moves through the landscape, and the way it's cleansed in the landscape. And it worked for quite a while, but as we're seeing from all of this water depletion and so on, it's not working as well anymore. So we need, as Einstein said, to think differently as we go about solving these problems. In a way, we have to think about, okay, we have a big dam proposed. Well, can conservation and efficiency, if we double down on conservation and efficiency, can we meet our needs that way? Do we really need to raise the levee? Or maybe we should give the river some of its floodplain back, which would generate all kinds of extra benefits in terms of not only controlling the flood, but cleansing the water, storing the water, so that the next year, if a drought arrives, we have some water in storage in the system. These are the new ways of thinking that we're beginning to see, and I document a lot of them in my book from around the world. And I would just like to give you a couple of quick examples of how this collaboration, innovation, and partnership and getting smarter about how we use water can help us meet these needs in this different way going forward. Let me start with an example in agriculture, because agriculture accounts for 70% of global water use. So when you think about that map of global water depletion, most of that red is due to the fact that growing crops is very, very water intensive. Our diets make up half of our water footprint. If we're an average American, we use on the average of 2,000 gallons of water a day. Half of that to meet our needs, to keep our lifestyles afloat, if you will. More than 2,000 gallons a day, and more than half of that is in our diet. And it's simply because it takes a lot of water to transpire and the growth of crops, right? Just growing crops takes a lot of water, whether you're doing it efficiently or not. Crops need a lot of water to grow. So half of it is in diet. So if we're going to solve the problems of water depletion and algal blooms, collaborations with agriculture, collaborations with farmers is going to be extremely important. And we're beginning to see some really great signs of hope there that new management practices on farms can really help. When I was with National Geographic, as we heard from Jeff this morning, we started a program called Change the Course, which is a national water stewardship movement that began to work. We were a partner always a partner in this. We never initiated these projects, but collaborative efforts to show that we can have prosperity, economic growth and prosperity side by side with healthy ecosystems. One of the areas we're interested in is this Flint River Basin in the southeastern part of the country, because it is a hotspot of biodiversity in the United States and the world. The incredible diversity of fish, of freshwater mussels in this area warrants its attention from a conservation perspective. Back in the 80s or so, I think I went a little too fast here, but that big irrigation system that you saw in that previous slide, the center pivot systems, they create the big circles that you see when you fly across the country. They literally rolled in to Georgia to start growing irrigated peanut production, cotton production, and it depleted so much groundwater that the rivers and streams in the Flint River Basin were beginning to dry up during that summertime. And so a partnership emerged between the University of Georgia, between the Flint River Soil and Water Conservation District, and some local farmers that were willing to participate in this experiment to look at how collaborative water management that was aimed at getting smarter about how this water was used could work, and whether it could make a difference in this region to saving the freshwater life in these rivers and creeks. And so what's been done is similar in some ways to what you're doing here at Lake George. It was beginning to look at putting sensors in the soil so that you could measure and monitor in real time how much water those crops really needed. And then program your center pivot system. This is Casey Cox with the Flint River Soil and Water Conservation District on the right. At the control box, you have a smart irrigation system that's able to receive this information, equipped with a GPS system, so when that center pivot goes around to deliver the water to the field, it can tailor those water deliveries to the conditions in the field and only deliver as much water as that particular area of the field really needs. Well, this is a recipe for getting more crop per drop, which is exactly what we need. If there's not more water to pull out of the ground and to put in a new dam, well, then we have to get smarter about how we use it. And this is one way to do that. And what they're testing is then if we adopt this in strategic locations, can we then see more base flow, more summertime flow in these tributaries that are supporting the freshwater mussels and the fish that we're concerned about losing? So this is a great example of that collaborative model. One of the first projects we got involved with on the other side of the country was the Verde River. If any of you have been to central northern Arizona, this is one of, I would say, the 3 most important, precious desert rivers we have left in the American Southwest. Because it still has a healthy riparian riverside forest that is critical to the migratory bird populations that go from Central America all the way up to the Arctic every year. They need to stop and rest and breed and then move on. And this is one area where they can do it. Incredible, hundreds of different bird species use this riverside system throughout the year. But as in most of the West, most of this water from the river is diverted into an irrigation ditch and has been for a century and a half to grow crops. And so during the summer, much of this river would be dry. 5, 6, 7, 8 miles would be nearly dry during that summer season. So not good for the fish, not good for the birds, not good for the habitat. And so in this case, I saw the Nature Conservancy as a partner here on Lake George. The Nature Conservancy of Arizona came in and began to partner with the farmers and corporations interested in making sure that they have a healthy river for recreation and so on, began to invest in this river. And today we have what I think is becoming a poster child of river restoration in this country in the form of the Verde River. And really it started with a very simple technology, an automated solar-powered headgate that allowed the irrigators to take out of the river just the water they needed and leave the rest for the river. They couldn't do this before. They would take everything out because they could, and they didn't have a way to measure it and monitor it, but now they do, and they can leave more water in the river, no loss to agricultural production. So it's a triple win, right? They have a healthier river, they have an upgraded irrigation system, improved habitat, more recreation, and it's good for the economy, good for the environment, good for the farmers. And so it's a great example of this kind of win-win-win situation if you work together, collaborate, get smarter about how do you use this water. I love this example, and it has spawned a lot of other really fascinating changes in the basin. Farmers switching from alfalfa, which is a very thirsty crop, to barley, which is much less thirsty and takes water at a different time of the year, more in the spring than the summer, and building a barley malt facility and feeding into the microbrew industry in Arizona. So it spawned a lot more innovation. These collaborations with farmers are also, I think, really important in building back the health of the soil. I have to say, as somebody who's worked on water issues for 35 years, I came very, very late to understanding the importance of the health of the soil in the water cycle. If you look at the numbers, soils around the world are able to hold 8 times more water than all the world's rivers combined. And yet we haven't managed the soil as a water reservoir. We just haven't done that. And so industrial agriculture, which has been tremendously productive from a food production standpoint, has depleted that soil reservoir, if you will. When you remove carbon from the soil, allow that to run off and blow away with wind and water erosion, you're taking away that fertility of the soil. It can no longer hold as much water. And so we're beginning now to see a lot of collaboration throughout the states to try to restore that soil health, both in terms of farming and ranching. And it's a very, very promising area to watch. And the nice thing is, when you start to do this, you get multiple benefits. You're going to have reductions in flood damage. The soil is holding more water. You're going to have reductions in impacts from drought because the soil is holding more water. The farmer's going to have more there to work with in a year without rain. And you're going to keep that nitrogen and phosphorus on the land. And you're going to need less chemical fertilizer in the first place because you've got more healthy soil. And so we're seeing this happen. And one of the areas that's really promising is this move toward planting cover crops. If you go across the country, you'll see a lot of this, black and brown soil just sitting empty during the non-growing season. And that land is just going to be washed and eroded away, and that nitrogen and phosphorus are flowing into our rivers and streams then and heading out to our lakes and coastal areas. Planting cover crops is a really good way to improve the health of the soil and keep that soil and the nutrients on it in place. We had, as of, I think, 2012, only 3% of our cropland in this country with cover crops during that off-season. Now it's 6%, so it's doubled. But we still have a long way to go. This is a cover crop cocktail, as they say, that is appropriate for New York. This is an example of a demo plot here in New York. So farmers are getting interested. There's collaborations to make this happen, and I think we can hope that this becomes a much more routine way for farmers to use their land with support. Obviously, it takes policy and incentives to get this done. So really, really promising. Okay, so we've heard a lot this morning about septic systems. And I just want to make a note to say that these innovative designs, this kind of next generation of septic systems, is going to be really critical for preventing algal blooms, where septic systems especially are the main source of this nitrogen. Important source here at Lake George, important source on Long Island, where I grew up in. I didn't grow up in Suffolk County, I grew up in Nassau County, but Suffolk County has the most dense septic system geography of any place in the country. It's got more density of septic systems than anywhere in the country. And not surprisingly, Suffolk County is dealing with a huge problem of algal blooms. So they are now demoing a number of these innovative and advanced treatment systems to try to deal with their septic problem. And if you look at it, there's an extra chamber in here compared with the traditional, the older generation of septic systems, an extra chamber in here where the air is pumped in, and you generate a community of microbes that's actually able to digest nitrogen. And so these advanced systems can typically reduce nitrogen by half. So very important for getting that nitrogen under control, the movement toward this next generation of septic systems in dealing with algal blooms. We heard about stormwater. I'm going to skip over that because we're running out of time, but this is also very important. If you're interested in what's happening with green infrastructure, there's many cities in this country doing amazing things. China, believe it or not, has a national program called Sponge Cities, trying to introduce this innovative design into 30 pilot cities to show that we can turn stormwater from a nuisance into an asset. And they're doing it for water quality, but also for water storage and dealing with droughts. So this kind of innovative design in our urban landscape is designed to improve the whole water cycle in our urban areas. And again, will be very important to the quality here at Lake George. So just to wrap this up very quickly, I think this statement by Luna Leopold says a lot. And while we're thinking about it, let me just end with a few thoughts about Lake George. The health of our waters is the principal measure of how we live on the land. I see this collaboration to protect Lake George, and here we are in this dark room, right? We've got a beautiful lake right outside. It seems to me it's so exciting and so important for a number of reasons. First, I would say it's sort of an unparalleled model to apply the best science, the best technology, literally sensing the lake, understanding the lake, so that it can be protected. And that word protected is important because most of the projects that I've been partnering on and in some small way involved in are about restoration. We're trying to fix something, to bring back something that's been lost. Here, you're primarily talking about protection. You're talking about keeping Lake George clean and healthy. And that's a place of strength to start from. But as we've heard from Dr. Kelly this morning and from other presentations, it's nothing to take for granted because things are changing. So it's a healthy lake, and you're starting from a place of incredible strength, and yet, wow, we can't take that for granted. Second, the model here of collaboration between, a cutting-edge technology company, between a first-in-class science and engineering university, between, with a committed community that loves its lake, and the Fund for Lake George. I can't name another collaboration that's quite that remarkable. And so that is, again, an incredible position of strength, I think, and a recipe for success. And third, and I'll be sort of echoing something you've heard this morning, this model can be adapted and used and scaled for use elsewhere. And that's very important. We have these problems emerging everywhere. And with the incredible knowledge and science and technology that's coming from the Jefferson Project and the Fund for Lake George's work overall, this can be a real beacon for work elsewhere. And so many of us, I'm sure, will be watching to see what happens here. You know, in a world, in a sense of hotspots, we hear a lot about hotspots around the world. I think Lake George is emerging as what we might call a hope spot. You know, the idea that we can have a healthy lake and a healthy economy side by side together for generations. And that's what's starting to emerge, and it's really, really exciting. And so I'm going to be rooting, a lot of us are going to be rooting. Thank you all for your concern about fresh water, for coming today and for listening and sharing your thoughts. So I appreciate this opportunity. All right, thank you very much.
Thank you, Sandra. I can't really add anything to that. The global perspective is what we need to hear, but I think the quote of the day is that Lake George is a hope spot. It's a hope spot, and thank you for coining that phrase. And
No, it's not mine.
It's not yours, but somebody in the room will take credit for it, all right? So thank you, Sandra. We would like to give you something that we all in this room cherish. It's a piece of art that has Thomas Jefferson's letter to his daughter Martha in 1791, where, as we all know, he said, "This is the most beautiful waters I've ever seen." We'd like to present that to you now.
Oh, thank you. Wow.
Hold it. I'll do it. Yep.